My father stood in the grand foyer of the city's most exclusive venue, pointed his finger at the heavy oak doors, and told me I was banned from my own mother's 60th birthday party. He looked me up and down, called me a complete loser, and said my presence would only embarrass his wealthy white son-in-law. I did not scream or throw a fit. I just smiled, looked him dead in the eye, and asked if he was really choosing fake prestige over his own flesh and blood. When he proudly said yes, I simply walked over to the venue manager and canceled the entire $50,000 event. They had absolutely no idea who really owned the building. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who constantly underestimated your worth and used you as their designated scapegoat. My name is Camille. I am 35 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I have been the disappointment of my family. Growing up in our affluent, image-obsessed African-American household in a pristine Atlanta suburb, excellence was not just encouraged, it was weaponized. My father, Warren, was a man who cared more about how our family looked to his golf partners than how we actually felt behind closed doors. He demanded a specific type of success. You were either a corporate lawyer, a surgeon, or a failure. When I chose to build my own business from the ground up, instead of climbing a rigid corporate ladder, he practically erased me from his narrative. He poured all his pride and financial support into my younger sister Brianna, the undeniable golden child. Brianna played his game perfectly. She attended the right schools, wore the right designer labels, and ultimately married Trent, an arrogant finance broker from a supposedly elite white family. Trent brought the exact kind of country club validation my father had spent his entire life desperately chasing. But what none of them knew was that my relentless years of grinding had paid off. I was no longer the struggling freelancer they loved to mock. I was the silent founder and majority owner of Lumina Hospitality, a multi-million-dollar commercial real estate and luxury event firm. I owned the very spaces they clamored to get into. And that brings me to the afternoon of the party. I was standing in the center of the grand foyer at the Vanguard Estate, my company's crown jewel property. The space was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden light over the imported marble floors. I was meticulously reviewing the floral arrangements. Cascading white orchids and lush hydrangeas wrapped around the grand staircase just the way my mother Yvonne always loved. I had funded this entire lavish birthday gala anonymously. My mother had spent 60 years shrinking herself to fit my father's overbearing demands, constantly smoothing over his harshness and enabling his favoritism just to keep the peace. Despite the pain her complicity caused me, I wanted her to have one night of pure, unadulterated magic, a night where she felt truly celebrated. I was gently adjusting a misplaced orchid when the heavy mahogany doors swung open with a resounding thud. The echoing click of expensive leather shoes against the marble floor made my stomach tighten. I turned around to see my father marching into the foyer, flanked by Brianna and Trent. Warren looked impeccable as always in a tailored charcoal suit, his posture rigid with unearned authority. Brianna clung to Trent's arm, draped in silk, while Trent wore a smug, dismissive smirk that seemed permanently etched onto his face. The moment my father locked eyes with me, his expression hardened from mild irritation to absolute disgust. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not say hello. He closed the distance between us, his voice echoing loudly in the cavernous space. "What in the world are you doing here, Camille? The party does not start for another 5 hours, and frankly, I told your mother it was a mistake to even put you on the guest list." I took a deep breath, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I am just making sure the setup is correct, Dad. Mom deserves everything to be perfect today." Brianna let out a sharp, condescending laugh. She stepped forward, looking me up and down with an expression of sheer pity. "Oh, please! Are you trying to act like you have some VIP access just because you showed up early? You are probably just trying to secure a plate of free food before the real guests arrive. Do not ruin this for Mom. Trent's parents are flying in from Boston tonight, and everything needs to be flawless." Trent chimed in, adjusting his expensive watch with an air of calculated arrogance. It was the same subtle, racially coded microaggression he always used when dealing with me, the kind of disrespect my father willingly ignored. "Listen," Camille Trent said smoothly, his tone dripping with patronizing concern. "We understand you have had a rough go of it living on a budget and all. But this is a high society event. My folks are accustomed to a certain caliber of people. We just cannot have you bringing your bitter energy to the table. Maybe you should just sit this one out. Know your place, you know." My blood ran cold. I looked at my father, waiting for him to defend me, waiting for him to tell this arrogant man that he could not speak to his eldest daughter that way. Instead, Warren nodded in aggressive agreement. "Trent is absolutely right," Warren snapped, stepping closer to me, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. "Look at you. You are wearing a cheap blazer. You have no real career, no husband, and absolutely no sense of decorum. You are a loser, Camille. I have spent my entire life building a respectable name for this family, and I will not let you tear it down tonight. You will not be attending this dinner. I want you out of this building right now." The sheer audacity of his words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. This was the man whose approval I had chased for 3 decades. This was the man who had happily paid for Brianna's Ivy League tuition while refusing to co-sign a basic student loan for me. And here he was standing in the lobby of a building I owned, kicking me out of a party I had paid for, all to protect the fragile ego of a white son-in-law who was secretly bleeding him dry. I did not feel the familiar sting of rejection. I did not feel the urge to cry or beg for my rightful place at the table. For the first time in my 35 years of life, the heavy, suffocating chain of seeking my family's validation just snapped. The illusion shattered completely. I stood up perfectly straight, looked my father directly in the eyes, and smiled. It was a cold, peaceful smile. "So that is your final decision?" I asked softly. "You are choosing the illusion of money and the approval of this man over your own daughter?" Warren scoffed, rolling his eyes as if my question was the most ridiculous thing he had ever heard. "I am choosing the people who actually contribute to this family's legacy. Now get out before I have security throw you out." I held his gaze for 3 long seconds. I did not argue. I simply turned on my heel and walked purposefully across the marble floor toward the front concierge desk, where the venue's general manager, Marcus, was standing with a clipboard. He had been watching the entire exchange with quiet horror. I leaned over the mahogany counter, my voice steady and unwavering. "Cancel it," I said. Marcus blinked, his eyes widening. "Ms. Camille, are you sure the food, the band, the floral arrangements?" "I am absolutely certain," I replied, never taking my eyes off the manager. "Retract the $50,000 deposit. Tear down the flowers. Inform the catering staff they can take the night off with full pay. The event is completely canceled." I turned back to face my family. Warren was laughing, a deep, mocking sound that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. Brianna was shaking her head, whispering something to Trent about me being delusional. They genuinely believed I was just throwing a pathetic, powerless temper tantrum. They were about to learn exactly who held the keys to the kingdom. Warren finally stopped laughing and wiped a tear of amusement from the corner of his eye. He turned to the venue manager, completely dismissing my presence. "Marcus, I apologize for my eldest daughter," Warren said, his voice dripping with condescension. "She has always had a flair for the dramatic when she feels left out. Just ignore her little outburst and continue with the preparations." Marcus stood frozen, holding his tablet. He looked at me, waiting for my signal. I did not give it yet. I wanted to see exactly how far my family would go. Trent stepped forward, buttoning his tailored suit jacket. He looked around the extravagant lobby and then fixed his eyes on me with a look of utter pity. "You really have zero self-awareness, do you, Camille? Look around you. This is a premier elite establishment. You cannot just march in here wearing a budget boutique pantsuit and pretend you have the authority to give orders. It is frankly pathetic. My family is flying in from Martha's Vineyard tonight. They are accustomed to a certain level of class. If they saw you acting like a jealous child in the middle of this beautiful venue, they would be absolutely appalled." Brianna moved to stand shoulder to shoulder with her husband, crossing her arms. Her diamond tennis bracelet caught the light of the chandelier overhead. She cannot help it, Trent. She has always been deeply resentful of anyone doing better than her. Dad, remember when she actually tried to convince us she was going to be a CEO just because she was taking those cheap night classes at the community college? Warren let out a sharp, dismissive scoff. I remember perfectly. I told her back then she was wasting her time and my patience. I refused to throw my hard-earned money away on a pipe dream when she did not even have the discipline to follow a traditional career path. Exactly? Brianna added, her voice echoing brightly against the marble walls. Unlike my Ivy League education, it takes a proper pedigree to understand how high society works, Camille. Dad invested heavily in my future because I actually had one worth investing in. You dropped out to hustle on the internet. There is a massive difference between real generational class and whatever it is you are trying to project right now. You are just embarrassing yourself. I stood there and let their words wash over me. For years, comments exactly like these would have sent me spiraling into a deep, silent shame. I would have internalized every insult and worked twice as hard the next day just to prove them wrong. But today, standing in the very building I purchased with my own cash, their insults sounded entirely hollow. A proper pedigree, I repeated calmly, keeping my voice perfectly steady. Is that what we are calling it now, Brianna? Dad spent over $200,000 to get you through a degree program you almost failed twice. And Trent, your family might summer in the vineyard, but we both know who actually paid for your luxury car sitting in the driveway right now. It certainly was not your trust fund. Trent bristled, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He took a threatening step toward me. Watch your mouth. You have no idea what you are talking about. Do not speak to your brother-in-law that way. Warren snapped, his authoritative tone cutting through the air like a whip. Trent is a respected financial analyst. He has brought more honor and status to this family in 3 years of marriage than you have in your entire 35 years of life. You have always been overwhelmingly jealous of your sister. You were jealous when I bought her first condo right out of college, and you are jealous now because she has a perfect marriage, a wealthy family, and a lifestyle you will never be able to achieve. Warren stepped closer, towering over me just like he did when I was a terrified teenager. I did not shrink back this time. You think because you managed to scrape together a few dollars, you can walk into a place like this and ruin your mother's night? Warren demanded. I will not allow it. I have spent my entire life building a respectable name for this family. I sacrificed everything to ensure Brianna and Trent had the foundation they needed to succeed. You chose to walk away from my guidance, and now you have to live with the consequences of being a failure. I looked at my father's face. I traced the familiar lines of anger around his mouth and the cold, unyielding pride in his eyes. I looked at Brianna, who was hiding a smug smile behind her manicured hand, reveling in my scolding. I looked at Trent, the arrogant outsider they had chosen to protect over their own blood. My shoulders dropped, my jaw unclenched. The heavy, suffocating burden of wanting my father to look at me the way he looked at Brianna simply evaporated into the cool air of the foyer. The desperate, aching need to be loved by these people vanished, leaving nothing but absolute clarity. I did not need to scream. I did not need to cry. The family bond they constantly used to manipulate me was officially dead, and I was the one holding the shovel. I used to think there was something fundamentally broken in me, I said quietly. The catering staff in the background had stopped moving, sensing the heavy tension. I spent my entire 20s trying to figure out what I did wrong. I agonized over why my own father would co-sign a massive mortgage for a son-in-law he barely knew, but would not even show up to my community college graduation. But looking at the three of you right now, desperately clinging to an illusion of wealth while standing in a room you do not own, I realize I was never the broken one. You are all just terrified of the truth. Warren's face contorted with pure rage. Save the amateur therapy session for someone who actually cares, Camille. I am entirely done entertaining this ridiculous nonsense. Marcus, call your security team immediately and have this woman removed from the premises so we can finally prepare for the real guests. Marcus did not flinch when my father barked his orders. He did not rush to the front desk to call for backup. Instead, the seasoned general manager slowly lowered his tablet, adjusted his tailored suit jacket, and completely ignored my father. He turned his body entirely toward me, giving a slight respectful bow of his head. "Right away, Ms. Camille Marcus," said his voice carrying the calm, steady authority of a man who knew exactly who signed his paychecks. "I will have the catering staff pack up immediately, and I will dispatch security to the foyer to assist with the removal of unauthorized guests." Warren blinked, his face twisting into a mask of pure confusion. He stepped forward, his chest puffed out in indignation. "Excuse me. Are you deaf? I am the father of the guest of honor. I told you to remove this woman. She has nothing to do with this event." Marcus finally looked at my father, and the absolute lack of respect in his eyes was something I will never forget. "I heard you perfectly, sir. However, I do not take orders from guests. I take my orders exclusively from the owner of this establishment." Brianna let out a sharp, mocking laugh, glancing between Marcus and me, as if we were performing a poorly rehearsed comedy routine. "The owner? What are you talking about?" "The Vanguard estate is owned by a corporate investment group. My husband had his firm look into it when we were trying to book a charity gala here last year. Camille does not own anything. She rents a one-bedroom apartment." Trent nodded, crossing his arms with a smug, self-satisfied smirk. "Exactly. Lumina Hospitality owns this venue. You are risking your job, pal, humoring her like this. When the real owners find out you let a disgruntled family member hijack a $50,000 private event, you will be blacklisted from the industry." Marcus did not even blink. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out a sleek silver business card, and handed it directly to Trent. Trent took it, his eyes scanning the embossed lettering. "You are absolutely correct, sir," Marcus said smoothly. "Lumina Hospitality does own this venue, along with 4 other commercial properties in the metropolitan area. What your firm apparently failed to uncover during their amateur background check is that Ms. Camille is the sole founder, CEO, and majority shareholder of Lumina Hospitality. She does not just own this building, she is my boss. And since she has officially retracted the anonymous $50,000 deposit that funded tonight, you are currently trespassing on her private property." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that seemed to suck the oxygen right out of the grand foyer. I watched as Trent's eyes darted frantically from the business card to my face, his arrogant smirk melting into a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. Brianna's jaw physically dropped, her manicured hands trembling as she grabbed Trent's arm to look at the card herself. My father looked like he had been struck by lightning. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him a pale, ashen gray. He looked at the crystal chandeliers above us, the imported marble beneath his feet, and then finally at me. For the first time in my entire life, he was not looking at me with disappointment or disdain. He was looking at me with fear. Camille Warren stammered, his voice suddenly losing all of its booming authority. "Is this true? You own this?" "That is the beauty of moving in silence, Dad," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the vast room. "While you were busy judging my cheap blazers and praising Trent for renting luxury cars to look rich, I was busy buying the buildings you park them in. I spent years trying to fit into your narrow, shallow definition of success. But the truth is, my ambition was always too big for your fragile ego to handle." "Camille, let us be reasonable," Warren said, his tone suddenly adopting a sickeningly sweet, pleading quality that made my stomach turn. "This is a misunderstanding. We are family. Your mother is going to be here in a few hours. You cannot cancel her 60th birthday. Think about how this will look." "You made your position perfectly clear 5 minutes ago," I replied, taking a step back and crossing my arms. "You told me I was a loser. You told me I had no place in this family's legacy. You chose the illusion of money and the approval of a racist, arrogant son-in-law over your own daughter. I am simply respecting your decision. You do not want me at your table, so I am removing the table entirely." Before Warren could utter another pathetic excuse, the heavy double doors leading to the back offices swung open. 4 towering security guards in immaculate black suits marched into the foyer. They moved with military precision, stopping right behind Marcus. "Escort these 3 individuals out of the building," Marcus instructed calmly. "If they refuse to leave the premises, immediately call the police and press charges for trespassing." Do not touch me! Trent snapped, his voice cracking with panic, as a guard placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. I know the mayor. I work for a top-tier financial firm. You cannot treat us like this. Save it for the pavement, Trent. I said, coldly turning my back on them and walking toward the grand staircase. I did not stay to watch them get dragged out, but I heard every humiliating second of it. I heard Brianna crying, her high heels clicking frantically against the marble as she was forced toward the exit. I heard my father yelling empty threats about calling his lawyers, his voice growing fainter and more desperate as the heavy oak doors closed behind them. A profound sense of peace washed over me. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows near the entrance, hiding behind a lush potted palm to watch the final act of their public humiliation. Warren, Brianna, and Trent were standing on the cold concrete sidewalk, completely shell-shocked. The catering vans were already pulling up to the loading dock, instructed to pack up the food and go home. Brianna was sobbing into her hands, her perfect silk dress blowing awkwardly in the evening wind. Warren was pacing furiously, dialing a number on his phone with trembling fingers, no doubt trying to figure out how to salvage his precious reputation. But Trent was the one who caught my attention. He was standing a few feet away from them, his face pale and sweating. His phone began to ring loudly. He snatched it out of his pocket, looking at the screen with an expression of absolute dread before answering it and pressing it to his ear. "Mom! What is wrong?" Trent said, his voice loud enough to carry through the slightly open valet window near where I stood. There was a pause as he listened to the frantic voice on the other end. His eyes widened in panic. "What do you mean the cards were declined?" "All of them." "No, that is impossible. Did you tell the hotel concierge who we are? They cannot just lock you out of your suite." Trent turned away from my father and sister, pacing frantically toward the street corner, his hand running nervously through his perfectly styled hair. "Mom, listen to me. Do not panic. Just use the emergency reserve account." "What do you mean it is empty? Where did the money go?" I leaned against the cool glass window, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across my face. The cracks in their perfect facade were not just showing. The entire foundation was beginning to collapse. My father had traded his own flesh and blood for the illusion of generational wealth, only to end up standing on the curb with a fraud. They thought the cancellation of the party was the worst thing that could happen to them tonight. They had absolutely no idea the nightmare was just beginning. I watched Trent pacing furiously on the sidewalk from the safety of the venue lobby. His panicked voice echoed through the slightly open valet window as he desperately tried to understand why his wealthy parents were suddenly locked out of their luxury hotel suite. I did not stick around to hear the rest of his pathetic excuses. I turned my back on the glass walk to my car in the private underground garage and drove home with a sense of absolute peace I had not felt in 35 years. The next morning, my phone was a complete war zone. I sat in the plush leather chair of my downtown boardroom, sipping black coffee while my screen lit up with an endless stream of furious notifications. Brianna had sent me over 40 text messages before 7 in the morning. They were a masterclass in gaslighting and manipulation. "How could you do this to Mom?" the first text read. "You humiliated us in front of the entire city." Trent's parents had to downgrade to a cheap airport hotel because the concierge at the Ritz mysteriously flagged their accounts. "We know you did something to sabotage them. You are a bitter, jealous sociopath. Dad is having chest pains because of the stress you caused. You need to fix this right now or you are dead to us." I scrolled through this barrage of insults without a single flinch. 10 years ago, a message like that would have sent me into a spiral of anxiety. I would have drafted 1,000 different apologies, begging for forgiveness for a crime I did not commit. But today, I just felt exhausted by their predictability. My mother had not called or texted once. She was staying silent as she always did, letting my father and sister lead the charge. That silence was the final confirmation I needed. I calmly opened my settings, blocked Brianna's number, and then blocked my father's number for good measure. I set my phone face down on the mahogany table. I had a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition to finalize by noon, and I was not going to let the pathetic scramble of my toxic family interrupt my focus. After a highly successful morning finalizing the buyout of a boutique hotel chain, I left the Lumina Hospitality headquarters and drove across town. I pulled up to a modest, unassuming brick building. This was the small consulting office that served as the public-facing front for my business. It was the address my family knew, the place they assumed I ran my pathetic little startup that barely paid the bills. I kept it operational precisely for this reason, a perfect decoy to keep prying eyes away from my real empire. I had just settled at my desk to review some architectural blueprints when my desk intercom buzzed loudly. It was my receptionist, a sharp young woman named Chloe, and she sounded incredibly flustered. "Ms. Camille, I am so sorry," Chloe stammered over the speaker. "There is a man here who says he is your brother-in-law. I told him he needed an appointment, but he is refusing to listen and he is heading straight for your door." Before I could even press the button to reply, my office door was violently shoved open. It hit the wall with a loud crack. Trent stormed into the room looking completely unhinged. The perfectly tailored, arrogant finance bro from the night before was completely gone. His designer suit was wrinkled, his tie was loosened, and his face was flushed red with a desperate, frantic rage. He slammed the door shut behind him and marched directly to my desk, slamming both of his hands down onto the wooden surface. "You think you are so clever, do you?" Trent snarled, leaning over my desk to try and intimidate me. He reeked of stale coffee and pure panic. "You think you can play these little ghetto games with my family and just get away with it?" I did not back away. I slowly capped my pen, folded my hands together, and looked up at him with an expression of mild boredom. "Good afternoon, Trent. It is incredibly bold of you to barge into my office after I had you thrown out of my building last night. Did you need security to escort you out of this one too?" Trent let out a harsh, mocking laugh, but I could see the tremor in his hands. "Cut the garbage, Camille. We both know you do not actually own that venue. I do not know who you slept with or what kind of scam you are pulling with that general manager, but my father is having his legal team look into Lumina Hospitality right now. When they expose you, you are going to jail for fraud." I leaned back in my chair studying him. It was almost sad how deeply his arrogance blinded him. He literally could not fathom a world where a black woman he viewed as beneath him had built an empire he could not even afford to step foot in. "If your father's legal team is as competent as his credit limit, I think I will be just fine," I replied smoothly. "How are his accounts doing, by the way? Did they figure out that mysterious banking error at the hotel?" Trent's face went completely rigid. A flash of genuine terror crossed his eyes before he quickly masked it with more anger. "Do not you dare talk about my family. You have no idea who you are messing with. My father is a senior partner at a Wall Street firm. He could crush this pathetic little consulting business of yours with one phone call. He could make sure you never work in this city again." "Is that so?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Then why are you here, Trent? If you are so powerful and my business is so pathetic, why are you sweating in my office on a Wednesday afternoon instead of fixing your own mess?" Trent clenched his jaw so hard I thought his teeth might shatter. He stood up straight, trying to regain some semblance of his usual condescending posture. He pointed a shaking finger at me. "I am here to give you one chance to make this right," he demanded, his voice dropping into that familiar, patronizing tone. "Your father is furious. Your sister is inconsolable. You ruined a major networking opportunity for me. You are going to call that manager, you are going to apologize for your little stunt, and you are going to reinstate the booking for this weekend. If you do that, I will tell my father to call off his lawyers. I will convince Warren to let you back into the family. I am throwing you a lifeline, Camille. You need to know your place and take it before you lose everything." I looked at this pathetic, desperate man standing in my office. He was trying to threaten me with a father who was secretly broke, offering me a place in a family I had already discarded. He had no idea I had spent the morning running a full background check on him and his supposed elite relatives. I already knew his parents were drowning in massive debt. I already knew Trent had been secretly embezzling money from my father's retirement fund just to keep up the appearance of wealth. He was not throwing me a lifeline. He was drowning, and he was trying to use me as a raft. I smiled a slow, calculated smile that made the blood drain from his face. "Okay, Trent," I said softly. "I will reinstate the venue." Trent blinked, clearly surprised by how easily I surrendered. He puffed out his chest, a smug grin returning to his face as he adjusted his wrinkled suit jacket. "I knew you would see reason. You always cave eventually. That is the thing about you, Camille. You bark, but you never bite." I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a thick, legally binding document. I had my corporate lawyer's draft at 8 o'clock this morning. I slid it across the desk along with my heavy gold pen. "I will make the call," I said, keeping my voice perfectly compliant. "But because of the trouble caused last night, the venue requires a liability release form from the host. Since my father is currently refusing to speak to me, you will need to sign it as the family representative. It just states that you assume full responsibility for any damages during the rescheduled event." Trent scoffed, snatching the pen from my desk. He did not even glance at the fine print. He was too arrogant, too eager to run back to Brianna and Warren and brag about how he had put me in my place. He scribbled his signature aggressively on the bottom line and shoved the paper back toward me. "There. Now make the call," he ordered. I picked up the document, blowing gently on the wet ink. I locked it securely in the steel safe beneath my desk. It was not a liability waiver. It was a legally binding confession of debt, acknowledging that Trent owed Lumina Hospitality an exorbitant sum of money. He had just signed his own financial death warrant. The drive back to my penthouse that night was the quietest I had experienced in years. There was no anxious tightness in my chest. There was no obsessive replaying of the conversation in my head, desperately trying to figure out what I could have said differently to make my father respect me. I just rolled the windows down, let the cool night air fill the car, and listened to the steady hum of the engine. I slept deeply and dreamlessly, wrapped in the kind of absolute peace that only comes from finally cutting off an infected limb. When I woke up the next morning, the reality of their consequences had fully caught up with my family. I walked into my kitchen to pour a cup of black coffee. The morning sun was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the sweeping view of the city skyline. As soon as I set my phone on the marble island, the screen lit up like a slot machine. The notifications were coming in so fast the device was practically vibrating off the counter. I leaned back, took a slow sip of my coffee, and unlocked the screen. There were exactly 47 missed calls and over 60 text messages. The vast majority were from Brianna, interspersed with furious, commanding paragraphs from my father. I opened Brianna's thread first. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, manipulation, and playing the victim. "How could you do this to Mom?" the first text read, sent at 2 in the morning. "You humiliated us in front of the entire city." Trent's parents had to downgrade to a cheap airport hotel because the concierge at the Ritz mysteriously flagged their accounts. "We know you did something to sabotage them. You have always been a bitter, jealous sociopath. You ruined the most important night of Mom's life just to get back at me because you are single and miserable." The messages only grew more unhinged as the hours passed. By 4 in the morning, she was oscillating between sheer rage and pathetic guilt-tripping. "Dad is having chest pains because of the stress you caused. Mom has been crying in her room for hours. You need to fix this right now. You need to call that manager and beg for the venue back, or you are completely dead to us." I scrolled through the barrage of insults without a single flinch. 10 years ago, a message like that would have sent me into a severe panic attack. I would have internalized every word, drafted 1,000 different apologies, and begged for forgiveness for a crime I did not even commit. I would have drained my own savings to pay for Trent's parents to stay at the Ritz just to buy back my family's conditional affection. But today, looking at the glowing screen, I just felt exhausted by their predictability. My mother had not called or texted me once. She was staying completely silent, just as she always did, letting my father and sister lead the charge and tear me down, while she safely looked the other way. That silence was the final confirmation I needed. I switched over to my father's thread. His messages lacked Brianna's emotional hysteria, replacing it with cold, entitled demands. "I do not know what kind of fraudulent game you are playing with that venue manager," his text read. "But you are going to wire me the $50,000 deposit you stole immediately. Trent's family is facing a temporary banking error, and it is your duty as the eldest daughter to bridge the gap and protect this family's reputation. Call me the second you wake up. It was almost comical. The man had publicly disowned me, called me a loser, and thrown me out of my own building, yet he still believed he had the authority to demand my money to save his white son-in-law's fragile ego. I did not type a single letter in response. I did not justify my actions or try to explain my side of the story. I calmly opened my settings, blocked Brianna's number, and then blocked my father's number for good measure. I set my phone face down on the marble counter. I had a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition to finalize by noon, and I was not going to let the pathetic scramble of my toxic family interrupt my focus. An hour later, I stepped out of my private elevator and walked into the executive boardroom of Lumina Hospitality. I was wearing a tailored emerald green suit and carrying a leather briefcase. The contrast between my reality and the budget boutique narrative my family had created for me was stark. The boardroom was a beautiful, commanding space enclosed in glass overlooking the bustling financial district below. My executive team was already assembled around the massive oak table. My lead acquisitions director, a brilliant woman named Sarah, handed me a thick portfolio as I took my seat at the head of the table. "Good morning, Camille," Sarah said, tapping her pen against her notepad. "The representatives from the Vanguard Real Estate Group are ready to proceed. If we finalize this buyout today, Lumina Hospitality will officially become the largest luxury property owner in the metropolitan area. Are you ready to review the final terms?" I opened the portfolio, my eyes scanning the complex financial projections and asset transfers. My mind briefly flashed back to my father standing in the foyer the night before telling me I had no real career and no sense of decorum. He had spent his entire life begging for a seat at tables like this one, while I had quietly built the table itself. "I am more than ready, Sarah," I replied, my voice steady and authoritative. "Let us close this deal." For the next 3 hours, I completely immersed myself in the negotiations. I dismantled the opposing team's counter-offers with precision, securing the acquisition for $2 million under their initial asking price. By the time I signed the final contract, the room erupted into applause. I stood up, shook hands with the outgoing executives, and felt a profound sense of accomplishment. I was not a scapegoat. I was not a failure. I was exactly who I had worked so hard to become. After the meeting wrapped up, I packed my briefcase and prepared to head across town. While Lumina Hospitality was my true empire, I still maintained a modest, unassuming brick building on the edge of the city. It was a small consulting office that served as a public-facing front for my business. More importantly, it was the only address my family actually knew. It was the place they assumed I ran my struggling little startup. I kept it operational precisely for this reason, using it as a perfect decoy to keep prying eyes away from my real assets. I had some architectural blueprints to review, and I preferred the quiet isolation of the decoy office to get through the tedious paperwork. I had no idea that my decision to go to the decoy office that afternoon would walk me right into the next phase of my family's desperate collapse. They had realized their texts were not going through, and they were no longer content with throwing digital tantrums. They were escalating the war, and they were sending their most arrogant soldier right to my front door. Trent stood up from my desk with a triumphant smirk. He aggressively buttoned his wrinkled suit jacket, completely oblivious to the trap that had just snapped shut around his ankles. He looked around my modest decoy office one last time, his lip curling in disgust. "You did the right thing, Camille," he said, his tone dripping with fake magnanimity. "It is good to see you finally learning how to be a team player instead of a bitter outsider. I will tell Warren you were cooperative. Maybe he will even let you sit at the back table when we reschedule the party. Just make sure you dress a little more appropriately this time." I kept my expression entirely blank. "I will keep that in mind, Trent. Have a safe drive back to your mortgaged house." He sneered, clearly thinking my comment was just a weak, jealous jab, and stormed out of the office. The moment the glass door clicked shut behind him, I let out a long, slow breath. I leaned back in my chair and pulled up his financial file on my monitor. The idiot had just signed a confession of debt to Lumina Hospitality for the exact amount he had embezzled from my father's retirement fund. He thought he was intimidating me into submission using his coded language and empty threats about Wall Street daddies, but all he had done was hand me the loaded gun. I spent the rest of the afternoon wrapping up the Vanguard real estate acquisition. By 6 o'clock, my decoy office was dark and quiet. I was just packing up my briefcase when my phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text message from an unknown number, but I recognized the demanding tone immediately. Meet me at the Silver Diner on Route 47 in 20 minutes. Do not be late, we are settling this tonight. It was my father. He must have used my mother's phone, or a burner number after realizing I had blocked him. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to simply drive back to my penthouse and take a hot bath. But another part of me knew this was the perfect opportunity to lay the final piece of the groundwork. I grabbed my car keys. It was time to see exactly how desperate they had become. The Silver Diner was a run-down, neon-lit greasy spoon on the absolute edge of the city. It was the kind of place with sticky vinyl booths, flickering fluorescent lights, and the heavy smell of stale frying oil hanging in the air. It was a massive departure from the country clubs and five-star restaurants my father usually insisted upon. The fact that he chose this place told me everything I needed to know about his current financial reality. I parked my SUV in the dimly lit lot and walked inside. The bell above the door jingled pathetically. I spotted them immediately in a back corner booth. Warren was sitting rigidly with his arms crossed, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. Sitting across from him was my mother, Yvonne. She looked exhausted. Her shoulders were slumped and she was staring blankly into a mug of black coffee, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. I slid into the booth next to my mother. She flinched slightly but did not look up. "You are late," Warren snapped, tapping his watch. "Traffic was heavy," I replied smoothly, signaling the waitress for a glass of water. "What exactly are we settling? Dad Trent already came by my office today, demanding I fix the venue situation. I assumed he ran straight back to you to claim his victory." Warren scoffed, leaning forward and lowering his voice to a harsh whisper. "Trent handled the venue, yes, but that does not fix the immediate problem you caused. I spoke to the general manager after Trent left your pathetic little office. He informed me that the anonymous $50,000 deposit was refunded directly to the original account, your account." I took a sip of my ice water and raised an eyebrow. "That is correct. I paid for the party you kicked me out, so I took my money back. That is standard business practice." "Do not play smart with me, Camille." Warren growled, his face flushing with anger. "I do not know what kind of fraudulent scheme you are running to get your hands on that kind of cash, but you are going to wire that money to my account tonight." Trent's parents are experiencing a massive banking error. All of their accounts have been frozen, pending an investigation. Trent needs a bridge loan to cover their hotel expenses and keep them comfortable until the bank sorts it out. You humiliated this family, and it is your duty as the eldest daughter to make it right. I stared at him in genuine disbelief. He was sitting in a sticky diner wearing a suit he could barely afford, demanding I hand over $50,000 to fund the lavish lifestyle of a white family that looked down on him. "Let me get this straight," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You want me to give you my money so you can give it to Trent, who will then give it to his parents to pay for a luxury hotel suite?" "It is a temporary loan," Warren insisted aggressively. "You owe this family. You owe your sister an apology, and you owe Trent for the disrespect you showed him." I turned to my mother. She was still staring at her coffee, her hands trembling slightly around the ceramic mug. "Mom," I said softly, "are you seriously going to sit there and let him do this? You know exactly how he treats me. You know Trent's family is broke. Are you really going to let him drain whatever you have left, just to keep up appearances for Brianna?" Yvonne finally looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. For a split second, I thought I saw a flicker of maternal protection. I thought she might finally tell my father to stop, but then she let out a shaky sigh and looked away. "Just give him the money, Camille," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Please. You do not understand. Your father took out a second mortgage on our house to help Trent start his investment firm last year. We are overextended. If Trent's family finds out we do not have the liquid cash to help them with this hotel bill, Brianna's marriage could fall apart. We cannot lose the house. Just do what your father asks. Stop being so stubborn. The words hit me like a physical blow. A second mortgage. My father had risked the very roof over my mother's head, the home I grew up in, to fund a fake startup for a son-in-law who was actively stealing from him. And my mother, the woman I had anonymously spent $50,000 to celebrate, was asking me to fund my own abusers to protect her golden child. The final thread of hope I had for my parents simply snapped. I slid out of the vinyl booth and stood up. I looked down at the two people who had brought me into this world, and I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just profound, empty pity. I am not giving you a single dime, I said clearly. Not for Trent, not for Brianna, and certainly not for you. Warren's face contorted with pure rage. He slammed his fist on the table, rattling the silverware. You ungrateful brat! If you walk out that door, you are no longer my daughter. I am disowning you. Do you hear me? You will get nothing from me when I die. I pulled my wallet from my purse. I opened it and smoothly slid out my solid black Centurion card. The heavy metal caught the dim diner lights. I placed it gently on the table right next to his fist, signaling the waitress over. Put their coffee on this, I told the waitress. My father's eyes dropped to the card. He worked in banking for decades. He knew exactly what a Centurion card meant. He knew the invite-only status, the exorbitant spending requirements, the undeniable proof of massive, untouchable wealth. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He stared at the black metal as if it were an alien artifact. You disowned me a long time ago, Dad, I said, looking down at his stunned face. And as for your inheritance, keep it. I already own everything you are desperately trying to hold on to. I turned and walked out of the diner, the bell jingling behind me. The cool night air felt like a baptism. I got into my car and started the engine. Just as I shifted into drive, my phone chimed loudly with an urgent email notification. It was from my premier banking security team. I opened the message. Urgent fraud alert. An application for a high-interest personal loan of $100,000 has just been submitted under your Social Security number. I stared at the screen. The location of the application submission was traced back to my father's home internet address. They had actually done it. Desperate for cash after I walked out, Warren and Trent were attempting to use my old childhood tax documents to steal my identity. I smiled, put the car in gear, and dialed the direct line to my corporate attorney. It was time to burn their house of cards completely to the ground. Trent swaggered out of my office, a triumphant smile plastered across his face. He aggressively adjusted his tie and checked his expensive watch, completely blind to the fact that his every move was an illusion. The heavy glass door swung shut behind him, leaving me alone in the quiet hum of my decoy office. I did not move for a long moment. I just sat at my desk, listening to his heavy footsteps fade down the hallway. The moment I was sure he was gone, my hands flew across my keyboard. I was not just the owner of a massive real estate portfolio. Building Lumina Hospitality from the ground up required me to have an intricate understanding of corporate finance, asset tracing, and background verification. I had an entire department dedicated to vetting multi-million-dollar investors. Running a deep dive on Trent and his supposedly elite family was child's play. I pulled up the secure terminal I used for corporate acquisitions and typed in his parents' names. Trent had always painted his parents as old money royalty. He claimed they spent their summers yachting off Martha's Vineyard and their winters skiing in Aspen. My father bought the lie, completely bragging to his golf buddies about his daughter's brilliant marriage into high society. The search results loaded, and the truth hit the screen like a cold splash of water. There was no yacht. There was no ski chalet. Trent's parents, Richard and Helen, were not old money. They were practically drowning in new debt. I scrolled through pages of public records and financial filings. Their primary residence, a supposedly paid-off estate in Massachusetts, had a massive second mortgage on it. They had multiple maxed-out credit lines, a history of late property tax payments, and a recent string of denied loan applications from 3 major commercial banks. The banking error that caused their cards to be declined at the hotel the night before was not a mistake at all. They had simply run out of credit. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glowing monitor. Trent was not a wealthy heir. He was a desperate fraud scrambling to maintain an image he could no longer afford. But that did not explain everything. It did not explain how Trent had managed to fund Brianna's lavish lifestyle, the designer bags, the luxury cars, the constant stream of high-end vacations. If his parents were broke, where was the cash coming from? I dug deeper. I bypassed his parents' files and started tracing Trent's personal financial history. He claimed to run a highly successful boutique investment firm. I pulled the corporate filings for his company. The firm was nothing more than a shell. It had barely any active clients, and the few it did have were small-time local businesses. The revenue generated was a fraction of what Trent was spending on his own life. My eyes narrowed as I noticed a series of large recurring wire transfers entering Trent's business accounts over the last 18 months. The transfers were substantial, always in increments of $20,000 or $30,000. They were marked as consulting fees. I ran a trace on the routing numbers originating the transfers. The numbers led directly back to an account at a regional bank in Atlanta. I recognized the branch immediately. It was the same bank my father had used since I was a child. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I pulled my father's public financial records, cross-referencing the dates of the wire transfers. The pieces of the puzzle began to lock into place with terrifying precision. My father, Warren, had spent decades building a comfortable, respectable retirement fund. He was obsessed with financial security and public perception. But his records showed massive, unexplained withdrawals from his primary retirement accounts over the last 2 years. The dates of these withdrawals perfectly aligned with the dates the consulting fees were deposited into Trent's business account. But it was worse than just a few withdrawals. The records showed my father had recently taken out a massive line of credit against his own home. The house I grew up in, the house my mother still lived in. The funds from that home equity line had vanished into the same black hole of Trent's shell company. Trent was not just broke. He was actively bleeding my father dry. He had convinced Warren to invest his life savings and the equity of his home into a fake investment firm, using the money to fund Brianna's lifestyle and maintain the illusion of his own wealth. My father, blinded by his desperate need for high society validation and his absolute trust in his golden child's husband, had handed over everything. I sat back, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. Trent had just stood in my office threatening me, calling me a loser, demanding I fix a hotel booking for his bankrupt parents, all while secretly embezzling my father's entire financial future. And my father. He had kicked me out of my own building, disowned me in a cheap diner, and was now trying to steal my identity for a fraudulent loan, all to protect the man who was actively destroying him. I did not feel angry. I did not feel the sting of betrayal. I felt a surge of cold, calculated power. I had the entire blueprint of their destruction sitting on my hard drive. I downloaded every single document, every wire transfer receipt, every public filing, and compiled them into a secure, encrypted folder. I printed a hard copy of the most damning evidence and slipped it into a manila envelope. I picked up the phone and dialed my lead corporate attorney. "David," I said when he answered, "I need you to draft a formal debt collection notice immediately. I also need you to prepare the paperwork to legally seize an asset." "What kind of asset?" Camille David asked, his voice sharp and professional. "A house," I replied softly, my eyes fixed on the manila envelope. "I bought the debt on a second mortgage a few months ago through one of our holding companies. I want to initiate the foreclosure process immediately. They are defaulting on the terms, and I am calling the loan due." I hung up the phone and stood up from my desk. The game was no longer about a canceled birthday party. It was about absolute, undeniable reality. They had built their entire lives on a foundation of lies, and I was about to pull the final pillar out from under them. I hung up the phone with David and stared at the manila envelope on my desk. Foreclosing on my parents' house would strip away my father's false sense of security, but I knew it was not enough. Trent was a parasite. If I only took the house, he would simply detach from my ruined family and latch on to another wealthy victim to maintain his illusion of grandeur. I needed to trap him personally. I needed a document that legally bound Trent to the exact amount he had stolen from my father's retirement accounts, and I needed him to sign it voluntarily. My corporate lawyers were brilliant. Within an hour, they had drafted a confession of debt disguised as a standard commercial liability waiver. It was a masterpiece of legal misdirection. To the arrogant eye, it looked like a routine administrative form required to reinstate a canceled high-value event. In reality, the fine print clearly stated that the signatory assumed full personal financial liability for the embezzled funds, which were now legally owed to Lumina Hospitality as the parent company that had purchased the debt. I picked up my phone and dialed Trent's number. He answered on the second ring. He sounded out of breath, likely pacing around whatever cheap motel his parents were currently stranded in while they waited for their imaginary banking error to be resolved. "Hello, Camille," Trent said, his voice dripping with forced casualness and underlying panic. "Have you finally come to your senses?" I kept my voice soft, injecting just the right amount of exhaustion and defeat into my tone. "You win, Trent," I said. "My father is threatening to disown me completely, and my mother is begging me to fix this. The pressure is just too much. I cannot fight the entire family anymore. I will reinstate the venue for the party this weekend." Trent let out a loud, obnoxious laugh that crackled through the phone speaker. "I knew you would cave. You always bark louder than you bite. It is good to see you finally learning your place in this family. Brianna was right, you just needed a firm hand to remind you how things actually work." I gripped the edge of my mahogany desk, letting his insults slide right off me. I focused entirely on the trap. "There is just one administrative issue," I told him. "Because I formally retracted the $50,000 deposit last night, the venue management company placed a temporary security freeze on the dates. I can override the freeze with the general manager, but corporate policy requires a new financial guarantor to sign a liability release form. Since my father is still refusing to speak to me directly, and you are the successful investment banker of the family, I need you to be the one to sign it." The stroke to his fragile ego was absolutely flawless. Trent practically preened through the phone. "Of course," he said smoothly, his tone shifting from aggressive to fiercely arrogant. "Your father is too emotional right now anyway. He does not know how to handle high-level corporate policies. Leave the heavy lifting to me. Email the document over and I will handle it." "I cannot do that," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "It is a secure commercial document for a luxury venue. It requires a physical signature and a witness thumbprint to process the override. Come to my consulting office tomorrow morning at 9. You can sign it, and I will have the venue reinstated by noon." Trent agreed, hanging up with a smug command not to be late. The next morning, the city was covered in a cold, gray overcast. Trent strutted into my decoy office right at 9 o'clock. He was wearing a fresh designer suit, likely purchased on yet another maxed-out credit card, and carrying a leather briefcase that I knew for a fact was completely empty. He looked around my modest workspace with the same sneer of disgust he always wore when he was forced to interact with my side of the world. "Hand it over, Camille," he demanded, slapping his hands flat on my desk. "I have a very busy morning ahead of me. I need to manage real money for real clients, so let us get this over with." I slid the thick document across the desk along with a heavy gold pen. I had intentionally placed a brightly colored sticky note over the most critical paragraph of the fine print, the section detailing the assumption of the embezzled debt. The arrow on the note pointed directly down to the signature line. A seasoned financial advisor would have immediately removed the note, read every single clause of the contract, and realized he was signing his own financial death warrant. But Trent was not a seasoned financial advisor. He was an arrogant fraud who believed he was infinitely smarter than the black woman sitting across from him. He genuinely believed I was just a defeated small-time consultant handing over a basic permission slip. He grabbed the gold pen and scribbled his name with aggressive, sweeping strokes. He did not lift the sticky note. He did not read a single word of the dense legal text. He did not ask a single question about the terms. He just wanted to get his signature on the paper so he could run straight back to Brianna and my father and brag about how he had successfully bullied me into submission. He wanted to be the white knight who saved the family legacy. "There," Trent said, tossing the pen back onto my desk with a sharp clatter. Now make the call and get that venue unlocked so my parents can stop living out of suitcases. And do yourself a favor, Camille. Next time you try to play with the big dogs, remember who actually holds the leash. I slowly picked up the document. I blew gently on the wet ink to dry it, keeping my eyes fixed on the paper. I looked at his messy signature, confirming it was perfectly legible and legally binding. Then I opened the heavy steel safe beneath my desk. I placed the contract inside, shut the thick metal door, and locked it with a loud, satisfying click. "I will make the call right now," I said, looking up at him with a perfectly blank expression. "Have a wonderful day, Trent." He smirked, turned on his heel, and marched out of the office, practically kicking the glass door open in his rush to leave. I leaned back in my chair and let out a long, slow breath. The trap was now completely set. My father was desperately trying to secure a fraudulent loan in my name to save face. My mother was enabling the destruction of her own home by staying silent. Brianna was oblivious to the fact that her perfect marriage and endless wealth were nothing but a bankrupt illusion. And Trent had just legally confessed to owing Lumina Hospitality every single dollar he had stolen from my family. They all thought I was surrendering. They thought I was retreating to my corner, properly disciplined and put back in my place as the eternal family scapegoat. They had absolutely no idea that I had just locked all the doors, barred the exits, and lit the match. The illusions of grandeur they had used to torture me for 35 years were about to burn down to the absolute foundation, and I was the only person in the city holding the fire extinguisher. I left my office that evening with a profound sense of quiet victory. The confession of debt was securely locked inside my heavy steel safe. Trent had walked out the door, believing he had successfully bullied me into submission, completely unaware that he had just handed me the legal authority to destroy his entire fraudulent life. I walked to my car in the underground garage, ready to head home and pour a glass of expensive wine. But just as I started the engine, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I normally ignored those, but a strange instinct told me to answer. "Get to the Elm Street Diner on the edge of town. In exactly 30 minutes, my father's voice barked through the car speakers. "Do not make me wait, Camille. We are settling this right now." He disconnected the call before I could utter a single syllable. I stared at the dashboard, a dry laugh escaping my lips. The Elm Street Diner was a run-down, greasy spoon that sat on the absolute outskirts of the city. It was famous for flickering neon signs, sticky vinyl booths, and the heavy, permanent smell of burnt coffee. My father was a man who practically worshipped high society. He refused to eat anywhere that did not require a reservation and a jacket. The fact that he was summoning me to a cheap roadside diner spoke volumes. He was hiding. He was financially bleeding out, and he could no longer afford the luxurious backdrops he used to intimidate people. I put my SUV in drive and headed across town. I was not going to this diner to apologize. I was going to see exactly how deep his desperation ran. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few rusted pickup trucks and my father's mid-sized sedan. I walked through the glass doors, the bell above my head jingling pathetically. The diner was nearly deserted. I spotted them immediately in the very back corner booth, hiding in the shadows. My father was sitting rigidly, his arms crossed tight over his chest. He was wearing a casual polo shirt that looked entirely out of place on him, his jaw clenched in a state of permanent fury. Sitting across from him was my mother, Yvonne. She looked small, staring blankly down at a mug of black coffee. Her shoulders slumped under the weight of whatever argument they had just had before I arrived. I walked over and slid into the vinyl booth next to my mother. The seat squeaked loudly under my weight. My mother flinched slightly, but did not lift her eyes to meet mine. "You are 5 minutes late," Warren snapped, glaring at me as if my mere presence was a personal insult. "Traffic was heavy," I replied smoothly, leaning back against the cracked vinyl. "Why are we meeting here, Dad? I figured you would have summoned me to the country club to give me another lecture on high society decorum." Warren slammed his hand down on the sticky table. "Do not play smart with me, Camille. I do not have the patience for your typical bitter attitude tonight. Trent came to see you today. He told me you finally agreed to cooperate and release the hold on the venue, but that does not even begin to fix the absolute disaster you caused. I raised an eyebrow, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. Is that so? What else needs fixing? I spoke to the general manager of the venue this morning. Warren continued, his voice dropping into a harsh, accusatory whisper. I demanded he reinstate the party using the original funds. He informed me that the anonymous $50,000 deposit was officially refunded to the original payment method. He told me it went back to your account. He leaned across the table, his eyes narrowing with pure disgust. I know you do not actually have $50,000, Camille. You live in a cheap apartment and run a failing little consulting business. I do not know what kind of fraudulent chargeback scheme you pulled or who you scammed to get your hands on that kind of cash, but you are going to hand it over to me immediately. I stared at him. The sheer audacity of his logic was breathtaking. Even when confronted with the undeniable fact that I had funded the party, his brain literally could not process the idea of my success. It was easier for him to believe I was a criminal scamming a luxury venue than to admit his scapegoat daughter was a self-made millionaire. The money was refunded to me because it was my money, Dad, I said calmly. I paid for the event. You kicked me out. So I took my money back. That is how the real world works. I do not care how you got it, Warren hissed, ignoring my explanation entirely. You are going to wire every single cent of that $50,000 to my personal checking account by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. I let out a soft laugh. And why on earth would I do that? Because Trent's family is in a crisis, and it is entirely your fault, he demanded, his face flushing a deep, angry red. Richard and Helen are currently stuck at a budget motel near the airport. Trent informed me that they are victims of a massive international banking error. All of their elite accounts have been temporarily frozen pending a security investigation. They have no access to their wealth. Trent needs a temporary bridge loan to cover their expenses, get them back into a luxury suite, and pay for the rescheduled birthday dinner. I looked at him in genuine disbelief. Let me make sure I understand you correctly. You want me to give you $50,000 so you can give it to Trent. And Trent is going to use my money to put his supposedly wealthy white parents up in a 5-star hotel because his own accounts are mysteriously empty. It is a temporary bridge loan until the bank clears the error, Warren insisted aggressively. They are high society people, Camille. They cannot be expected to live like commoners while the bank sorts out a technical glitch. It is embarrassing for our family to have our in-laws treated this way. It is embarrassing for who? I asked, my voice dropping to a cold, hard register, because it sounds like it is only embarrassing for you. You are sitting in a sticky diner demanding your black daughter hand over her money to fund the lavish lifestyle of a white man who looks down on you. Do not you dare make this about race or class, Warren exploded, pointing a trembling finger at my face. This is about family duty. You humiliated your sister last night. You disrespected your brother-in-law. You ruined your mother's milestone birthday. It is your fundamental duty, as the eldest daughter, to step up and support the social standing of this family. You owe us. I put a roof over your head for 18 years. I gave you the family name. You will make this right, or I swear to God I will make sure you are permanently exiled from this family. I looked at the man sitting across from me. He was perfectly willing to drain me dry just to buy the approval of an arrogant finance bro who was actively stealing his retirement funds. He was willing to sacrifice his own flesh and blood on the altar of fake prestige. I shifted my gaze away from his angry, entitled face and looked down at the woman sitting quietly beside me. I needed to see if my mother was going to say a single word in my defense, or if she was going to do what she had done my entire life and throw me straight to the wolves. Yvonne kept her eyes glued to the chipped formica table. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant clatter of plates from the diner kitchen and the low hum of the neon sign in the window. I watched her hands tremble as she wrapped her fingers tighter around her cheap ceramic coffee mug. I waited. I gave her every opportunity to finally be a mother to me, to look at my father and tell him his demands were completely insane, to protect her eldest daughter for the very first time in her life. Mom, I prompted gently, my voice barely above a whisper. Tell him no. Tell him you will not let him sacrifice whatever money you have left for a man who does not even respect you." Yvonne let out a long, shaky breath. She slowly lifted her head, but she did not look at me. She looked across the table at Warren, her eyes full of a pathetic, desperate devotion. Then she turned to me, and the expression on her face shattered whatever lingering illusion I had left of her innocence. There was no maternal protection in her eyes. There was only deep, bitter irritation. "Camille, please stop making this so incredibly difficult," Yvonne said, her voice laced with heavy exhaustion. "Your father is under an immense amount of pressure right now. You are being entirely too selfish." Selfish. I repeated the word, tasting like ash in my mouth. "He is asking me to hand over $50,000 to fund his son-in-law, and I am the selfish one. You do not understand the stakes of this situation." Yvonne shot back, her tone suddenly defensive and sharp. "Brianna is used to a certain standard of living. She has a reputation to uphold among her friends and the country club board. Trent is a good husband to her, but his investment business has been struggling lately. He just needs a little push to get over this hurdle. If his parents find out about his temporary cash flow issues, they might cut him out of their trust fund entirely. We cannot let Brianna lose her marriage or her social standing over a minor financial setback." I stared at her, my mind struggling to process the absolute delusion she was choosing to live in. "There is no trust fund, Mom. Trent is broke. His parents are broke. They are not waiting on a banking error. They literally do not have the money to pay for a hotel room." I paused, leaning in closer to make sure she heard every single word. "And you know what else is broke? You and Dad." Warren slammed his fist on the table again, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple, but Yvonne held up a hand to silence him. She looked me dead in the eye, her jaw set with a stubborn, misplaced pride that made my stomach turn. "We are doing what good parents are supposed to do," Yvonne stated firmly, raising her chin. "We are protecting our family legacy. Yes, your father took out a second mortgage on our house. And yes, I signed the loan paperwork right alongside him. We gave Trent the money to keep his firm afloat because he promised us a massive return on our investment when his next commercial deal closes. We secured Brianna's future. We made sure she will never have to struggle. That is what matters." The air in my lungs suddenly felt freezing cold. "You knew," I whispered, staring at the woman I had spent my entire life trying to impress. "You knew Dad took out a second mortgage on the house." "Of course I knew," Yvonne snapped, rolling her eyes as if my shock was a massive inconvenience to her. "Your father and I make all of our financial decisions together. We gave Trent the $200,000 because he is our family. He needed the capital, and he has the pedigree to turn that money into millions." "And what about my future?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerously level register. "When I was 20 years old, I asked you both to co-sign a $10,000 student loan so I could finish my degree. You told me you did not have a single penny to spare. You told me I was a bad investment. You let me work 3 jobs and sleep in my car for a month just to make rent. But you happily signed away the equity of your only home to an arrogant white man who has been lying to you since the day you met him." Yvonne scoffed, a gesture so dismissive and cruel it physically stung. "Oh, please do not start with your exhausting victim narrative again, Camille. You always survived on your own. You are tough. You have always been hardened. Brianna is delicate. She was not built for hardship. She needs our protection and our guidance. You never needed us. Besides, we used the absolute last of our savings to pay for her luxury wedding last year. There was nothing left to give you anyway. You should be proud to step up and help your sister now that you have finally stumbled into some cash. It is the absolute least you can do after how much grief and embarrassment you have caused us." The absolute betrayal in her words washed over me like a tidal wave, drowning out the background noise of the diner. For my entire life, I had viewed my mother as a passive victim of my father's overbearing tyranny. I thought she was just too weak to stand up to him. I thought she secretly loved me, but was just too afraid to show it. I had anonymously paid $50,000 for a lavish birthday party just to give her one night of pure happiness. But sitting in this sticky vinyl booth, looking at her cold, unapologetic face, the agonizing truth finally set in. My mother was not a victim. She was an active, willing participant in my abuse. She had willingly sacrificed my financial security, my emotional well-being, and my future, all to ensure Brianna never had to experience a single moment of real-world discomfort. She had gambled her own home on Trent's fraudulent promises because she cared more about having a white son-in-law who looked wealthy than she cared about having a black daughter who actually worked hard. They had literally emptied their bank accounts, drained their retirement funds, and mortgaged their home down to zero, leaving absolutely nothing for me. No safety net, no inheritance, no family support, nothing but aggressive demands that I fix their catastrophic financial mistakes. I sat back against the booth. The tight, aching knot of guilt that had lived in my chest for 35 years completely dissolved. I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel the desperate, clawing need to argue or prove my worth to them. I just felt a profound, liberating emptiness. The woman sitting next to me was not my mother. She was just another stranger trying to use me to fund a fantasy. I looked at Warren, who was watching the exchange with a smug, satisfied smirk, clearly thrilled that Yvonne had put me in my place and defended his reckless choices. Then I looked back at Yvonne. "You are right, Mom," I said softly, my voice devoid of any emotion. "I always survived on my own. And you are right about something else, too. You have absolutely nothing left to give me." I reached into my purse, the absolute finality of the moment settling over me like a heavy protective armor. They wanted me to save them from a crisis they had entirely engineered. They wanted me to empty my pockets to protect Trent's fragile ego and Brianna's fake luxury. They had absolutely no idea that I already held the deed to their destruction, and that my own mother had just given me the absolute moral clarity to finally use it. I pulled my hand out of my purse, leaving it resting flat on the sticky Formica table. I looked directly at my father, then shifted my gaze to my mother. The lingering shadows of the frightened, desperate little girl who just wanted her parents to be proud of her completely vanished from my soul. "I am not giving you a single cent," I said. My voice was not loud, but it cut through the low hum of the diner with absolute undeniable authority. "Not 50,000, not $5. I am not funding Trent's fraudulent lifestyle, and I am certainly not bailing you out of the disastrous financial hole you dug for yourselves." Warren stared at me, his eyes wide with a volatile mixture of shock and rapidly rising fury. He was so accustomed to me bending to his will, to me chasing his crumbs of approval, that my outright refusal simply did not compute in his rigid mind. "Excuse me," he whispered dangerously, leaning forward, as if trying to intimidate me through sheer physical presence. "You heard exactly what I said." I continued, feeling a profound, radiant sense of lightness spreading through my chest. "You gambled your home on a man who lies for a living because he gave you the illusion of proximity to old money. You sacrificed my future to fund Brianna's designer bags and country club memberships. You made your choices, Dad. Now you get to live with the heavy consequences of those choices. If Trent's parents are stuck in a budget motel, they can get comfortable. Because my money is staying exactly where it belongs. With me." My mother gasped loudly, pressing a trembling hand to her chest. "Camille, how can you possibly speak to your father this way? After everything we have sacrificed to give you a good life, you are acting like a monster." "You have done absolutely nothing for me, Mom." I snapped back, my patience entirely exhausted. "You enabled him. You watched him tear me down for 35 years, and you nodded along because it kept you comfortable in your pristine suburban bubble. You are just as guilty as he is, and I am done pretending otherwise." That was the breaking point. Warren could not tolerate the disrespect from the daughter he viewed as a permanent underling. He slapped both of his hands flat on the table and stood up his chair, scraping violently against the cracked linoleum floor. The loud noise echoed through the empty diner, drawing the immediate attention of the few late-night patrons and the line cook wiping down the back counter. Warren leaned entirely over the table, towering over me, his face twisted into an ugly, terrifying mask of pure rage. "You ungrateful, miserable wretch," he spat, his voice booming across the small room. "I have spent my entire life trying to mold you into someone respectable. I gave you my name. I kept a roof over your head when you were nothing but a stubborn child. And this is how you repay me, by abandoning your own flesh and blood in a time of severe crisis. I did not shrink back into the vinyl booth. I looked up at him, my expression perfectly bored watching him lose control of his carefully crafted high society image in the middle of a cheap roadside diner. I am officially done with you, Warren shouted, pointing a shaking finger right between my eyes. Do you hear me, Camille? You are no longer my daughter. You are completely exiled from this family. You will not attend holiday dinners. You will not contact your sister. And when I die, you will not see a single dime of my estate. I am formally disowning you right here and now. You are completely dead to me. He stood there, his chest heaving, waiting for the devastation to hit me. He waited for the tears to well up in my eyes. He waited for me to apologize, to backpedal frantically, to pull out my checkbook and beg for my place back in his kingdom. Instead, I reached back into my purse. Your estate. I repeated, a slow, genuine smile spreading across my face. That is a very generous threat, Dad, but it is a little hard to inherit a second mortgage and a bankrupt legacy. Before he could process the sheer weight of what I had just said, I pulled out my wallet. I slipped my fingers into the center slot and retrieved my credit card. It was not a standard plastic bank card. It was a solid anodized titanium American Express Centurion card, the infamous black card. It was heavy, sleek, and strictly invitation only, reserved exclusively for individuals who spent millions of dollars a year. I held it up slightly, letting the dark metal catch the flickering neon light spilling through the diner window. Warren's eyes immediately locked onto the card. He had spent his entire career in banking and wealth management. He knew exactly what that piece of metal represented. He knew the exorbitant initiation fees and the rigorous financial vetting required to even hold it in your hand. He had spent his entire adult life desperately trying to reach a status that would earn him an invitation for one only to constantly fall short. The blood completely drained from his face. His mouth fell open slightly, his previous rage instantly replaced by a sudden paralyzing shock. His eyes darted from the card to my face, his brain short-circuiting as it tried to reconcile the daughter he called a loser with the undeniable proof of massive, untouchable wealth currently resting in her hand. I turned slightly and raised my hand to catch the waitress's attention. She scurried over cautiously, clearly nervous about the screaming match that had just occurred. I will take the check for their coffees, I told her softly, offering her a warm, reassuring smile to diffuse the tension. She pulled the small green slip from her apron and laid it on the table. The total was barely $10. I handed her the solid titanium card. She blinked, visibly surprised by the heavy weight of it, and hurried over to the register. The silence at the table was deafening. My father was still standing completely frozen, his eyes glued to the register where the waitress was swiping my card. My mother looked back and forth between us, entirely confused by the sudden dramatic shift in my father's demeanor. She did not understand the significance of the card, but she understood the absolute terror currently painted on her husband's face. "Warren?" my mother whispered, pulling frantically at his sleeve. "Warren, sit down. People are staring at us." He did not move. He could not look away from the register. The waitress returned a moment later, handing me the heavy card and the receipt book. I took my gold pen from my purse, signed my name with a deliberate flourish, and wrote in a $200 tip. The poor girl deserved it for having to listen to my father's ridiculous tantrum. I picked up the customer copy of the receipt. I stood up from the vinyl booth, smoothing out the front of my tailored emerald suit. I looked at my father one last time. Stripped of his authority and his booming voice, he looked incredibly small. He looked like exactly what he was, a broke, desperate man pretending to be a king. "Consider this my final contribution to the family," I said softly. I dropped the receipt directly onto his lap. I did not wait for a response. I turned on my heel and walked purposefully toward the exit. The diner bell jingled cheerfully as I pushed the glass door open and stepped out into the cool, crisp night air. I walked across the empty parking lot to my luxury SUV, the gravel crunching satisfyingly under my heels. I had finally done it. The heavy, suffocating chain of familial obligation was completely broken. I had looked my abusers directly in the eye, refused their unhinged demands, and walked away from their toxic kingdom without a single ounce of regret. I slid into the plush driver's seat of my SUV and closed the heavy door, shutting out the hum of the neon diner sign. I took a deep breath, savoring the absolute silence. I had finally done it. The heavy chain of familial obligation was broken. But before I could even shift the car into drive, my phone emitted a piercing, high-pitched chime that echoed loudly in the enclosed cabin. It was not a standard text message tone. It was the emergency override alert from my private wealth management firm. I picked up the phone. A bright red banner flashed across the screen. Urgent fraud alert. Identity verification required for pending personal loan application. I tapped the notification, authenticating the app with my face. The secure banking portal loaded, displaying a pending application for a high-interest unsecured personal loan in the amount of $150,000. I scanned the details. The applicant name was Camille, but the address listed was my parents' suburban home. The social security number attached to the application was mine. It was the exact number from my original paper card, the one my parents had kept locked in their fireproof safe since I was a child. I let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. My father had literally just stood in a diner, screamed that I was dead to him, and formally disowned me, all while he and Trent were actively trying to steal my identity to bail themselves out of their own bankruptcy. I looked closer at the digital footprint the bank had automatically captured. The application was submitted from my parents' home internet network. But Trent, in his infinite, arrogant stupidity, had listed his own burner email address and his secondary cell phone number for the two-factor authentication, clearly assuming the bank would not have my actual biometric data on file. He thought he was dealing with a standard slow-moving credit bureau. He had no idea he had just triggered the highest-level security protocol of an elite private bank that aggressively protected its multi-million-dollar clients. I did not panic. I did not feel the urge to call my father and scream at him. I simply pressed the direct dial button for Julian, the director of my private security team at the bank. He answered on the first ring. "Good evening, Miss Camille. I assume you are seeing the alert." "I am looking at it right now, Julian," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "I did not authorize this. Someone is using my childhood documents to forge an application." "I suspected as much," Julian replied smoothly. "The application was flagged immediately because the income stated does not match your actual tax brackets, and the destination account for the funds is registered to a shell company we previously flagged in our system. It appears to be tied to a Mr. Trent. Shall I simply decline the application and lock down your credit profile?" I looked at the diner through my windshield. My father was just walking out the front door, his shoulders hunched, arguing furiously with my mother. "No, Julian," I said softly. "Do not just decline it. I want you to freeze the application in a pending status so the digital trail remains active. Then I want you to compile the IP logs, the timestamps, and the destination account details and send them directly to my secure email. I am pressing felony charges." "Understood completely," Julian said. "I will have the packet to you in 3 minutes." I hung up the phone and immediately dialed my corporate attorney, David. He answered quickly despite the late hour. I gave him a brief rundown of the situation. I told him about the forged loan, the use of my social security number, and Trent's sloppy digital fingerprints all over the application. David let out a low whistle. "Camille, this crosses the line from civil financial disputes into federal territory. Wire fraud and felony identity theft carry mandatory minimum sentences. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed? This is your family." He stopped being my father the moment he gambled my future to fund a racist fraud. I replied without a single ounce of hesitation. "I want you to initiate the foreclosure on his house tomorrow morning, just like we planned. But tonight, I am going to the police precinct. I need you to meet me there. We are filing a formal report." "I will be there in 20 minutes, David said. I put the car in gear and drove away from the diner, leaving my parents in the rearview mirror. I did not go home to my penthouse. I drove straight to the Central Police Precinct downtown. When I walked through the double doors, David was already waiting for me in the lobby, holding a thick folder containing Trent's signed confession of debt and the digital logs Julian had just sent over. We sat down with a financial crimes detective. I laid everything out on the metal table. I did not protect them. I did not soften the blow. I handed over the proof of Trent's embezzlement, the confession of debt he had arrogantly signed in my office that morning, and the digital logs proving he and my father had conspired to steal $150,000 in my name. The detective reviewed the documents carefully, his expression growing more serious with every page. The sheer amount of money involved, coupled with the interstate wire implications of Trent's shell company, elevated the situation entirely. "This is incredibly thorough, Ms. Camille," the detective said, tapping his pen on the table. "We have more than enough probable cause here for identity theft and attempted grand larceny. Given the flight risk associated with the embezzled funds, we are going to act on this immediately. We will be sending officers to the origin address tonight to secure the devices used to submit the application and bring the suspects in for questioning." I nodded slowly. The origin address was my parents' house. As I walked out of the precinct and into the cool night air, I pulled out my phone. I had unblocked Brianna's social media accounts earlier that day out of sheer curiosity. I opened her page. Sure enough, she had just posted a perfectly filtered photo of a lavishly set dining table at my parents' house. The caption read, "Rescheduled birthday dinner for Mom. So happy Trent's wonderful parents could fly in to celebrate with us. Family is everything." I looked at the photo of the crystal wine glasses and the expensive catered food my father had likely put on yet another credit card. They were sitting around that table right now. They were smiling, drinking wine, and playing the roles of high society elites for Trent's bankrupt parents. They thought they had successfully navigated the crisis. They thought their fraudulent loan application was quietly processing in the background, securing the cash they needed to keep their lives afloat. They had absolutely no idea that multiple police cruisers were currently pulling out of the precinct garage, heading straight for their pristine suburban neighborhood. The perfect storm was not just brewing, it was already at their front door. I watched the taillights of the police cruisers disappear down the dark city street, heading straight for my parents' pristine suburban neighborhood. I stood on the concrete steps of the precinct for a moment, letting the cool night air wash over me. The heavy, suffocating weight that had pressed down on my chest for my entire life was completely gone. I turned to my corporate attorney David, who was adjusting his coat and preparing to head to his car. "I am not going home," I told him, my voice perfectly steady. "I want to see this. I want a front row seat when the illusion finally shatters." David nodded slowly, understanding the gravity of the moment. "I will follow right behind you," he said. I got back into my luxury SUV and drove toward the suburbs. The drive took exactly 25 minutes. As I turned onto my parents' quiet, tree-lined street, the neighborhood was completely still. The large manicured lawns and sprawling brick colonials looked exactly as they always did, a perfect wealthy facade hiding decades of emotional rot. I parked my car about half a block away from my childhood home, cutting the headlights. David pulled his sedan against the curb right behind me. We got out and walked silently down the sidewalk. The large bay window of my parents' formal dining room was completely illuminated, casting a warm golden glow over the front lawn. I stopped near the edge of their driveway, standing in the shadows of a massive oak tree, and watched the pathetic charade playing out inside. It was like watching a muted television show about a family pretending to be rich. Brianna was wearing a tight silk cocktail dress, pouring wine from a cheap bottle she had likely decanted to make it look expensive. She was laughing too loudly, performing the role of the perfect high society hostess. Sitting across from her were Trent's parents, Richard and Helen. They looked incredibly stiff and uncomfortable. Helen kept adjusting her pearl necklace, her face pinched in a tight, judgmental smile as she looked around the dining room. They were clearly furious about being downgraded from the Ritz to whatever budget motel they were currently staying in, and this dinner was my family's desperate attempt to pacify them. Trent was sitting at the head of the table next to my father, swirling his wine glass and talking animatedly. He looked so incredibly smug. He had a roof over his head, a beautiful wife catering to his every need, and wealthy in-laws he could use to boost his own ego. He genuinely thought he had won, but it was my father who caught my attention the most. Warren was sitting rigidly in his chair, his phone resting face up on the table right next to his plate. Every few seconds his eyes would dart to the screen. He was sweating. He was waiting for the email notification from the bank confirming that his fraudulent $150,000 loan had been approved and funded. He was praying for the cash that would save him from total ruin. He was never going to get that email. The heavy silence of the suburban street was suddenly completely shattered. The wail of police sirens tore through the neighborhood loud and aggressive. 3 separate police cruisers turned the corner at high speed, their tires screeching against the asphalt, as they boxed in my parents' driveway. Red and blue lights strobed violently against the white brick exterior of the house, turning the perfectly manicured lawn into an active crime scene. I watched through the bay window as the entire dinner party froze in absolute terror. Brianna dropped the wine decanter. It shattered against the hardwood floor, sending dark red liquid splashing across the bottom of her silk dress. Trent jumped out of his chair, his smug expression instantly replaced by sheer panic. Helen let out a visible scream, clutching her chest, while Richard stood up and backed away from the table. Warren grabbed his phone and shoved it into his pocket, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. The heavy thud of fists pounding on the thick oak front door echoed into the street. "Police, open the door immediately," a deep voice commanded. I stepped out from the shadows of the oak tree and walked slowly up the driveway, David walking right beside me. We reached the front porch just as my father pulled the door open. Warren instantly put on his deepest, most authoritative country club voice, desperately trying to project respectability. "Officers, there must be some sort of mistake," he said, forcing a tight, nervous smile. "This is a private residence. We are hosting a quiet family dinner." The lead detective, a tall man with a completely uncompromising expression, did not care about my father's tone or his tailored polo shirt. "Are you Warren?" The detective asked, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. "Yes, I am," Warren stammered, stepping back as 2 uniformed officers pushed past him and walked directly into the grand foyer. "But I demand to know what is going on here." The detective stepped into the house, and I followed right behind him, crossing the threshold of my childhood home for the last time. "We have a warrant to secure all computers, laptops, and digital routers on this premises," the detective announced, his voice carrying clearly into the dining room where everyone was huddled in shock. "We also have an arrest warrant for a Mr. Trent." Trent practically choked on his own breath. He stumbled out of the dining room and into the hallway, his face pale and sweating profusely. "Arrest warrant," Trent shouted, his voice cracking. "For what? I have not done anything. I am a licensed financial advisor. You cannot just barge in here." "You are being charged with felony identity theft, wire fraud, and attempted grand larceny," the detective stated flatly, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The uniformed officers immediately flanked Trent, grabbing his arms and forcing them behind his back. Brianna started screaming hysterically, rushing forward and pulling at the officer's sleeves. "Get your hands off my husband," she shrieked. "He did not do anything. This is a mistake. Richard, do something. Call your lawyers." Richard and Helen were standing in the doorway of the dining room, looking absolutely horrified. They were not calling any lawyers. They were broke, and they were watching their son get arrested like a common criminal. Helen covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Warren was shaking violently. He looked at the detective, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic pleading. "Officer, please listen to me. This is a massive misunderstanding. There is no fraud. It was just a family loan, a simple financial arrangement between family members. We can clear this up right now if you just let me call my daughter." "You do not need to call me Dad," I said, stepping out from behind the detective and into the bright light of the foyer. The entire house went completely dead silent. The only sound was the metallic click of the handcuffs locking around Trent's wrists. Warren stared at me, his jaw dropping open. Brianna stopped screaming. her eyes darting frantically between me, the police, and her handcuffed husband. "I am right here," I continued, my voice echoing coldly off the hardwood floors. "And I am the one who pressed the charges." Camille Warren breathed out, his voice shaking so badly he could barely form the words. "What have you done?" "I did exactly what I promised I would do," I replied, looking him directly in the eye. "I stopped funding your delusions. You really thought you could use my childhood social security number to steal $150,000 from a private wealth bank without triggering a federal security protocol. You are not a criminal mastermind, Dad. You are just a desperate man who got caught." Trent started struggling against the officers, his face turning dark red with fury. "You set us up, you bitter witch," he screamed at me, completely dropping his polite high society facade. "You planned this." "I did not forge your signature on that application, Trent," I said smoothly, stepping closer to him so he could hear every word. "I did not force you to embezzle $200,000 from my father's retirement fund. And I certainly did not force you to sign a legally binding confession of debt in my office this morning. You did all of that yourself because you thought you were untouchable." The words hit my father like a physical blow. He staggered backward, catching himself against the wall. "Embezzled," Warren whispered, turning to look at Trent with an expression of pure horror. "Confession of debt. What is she talking about, Trent?" The detective grabbed Trent by the arm and shoved him toward the front door. "You have the right to remain silent." The detective began reciting the Miranda warning as he hauled Trent out onto the porch. I stood in the foyer, surrounded by the shattered pieces of my family's perfect image. My father was hyperventilating against the wall, realizing that the son-in-law he had mortgaged his house for had been stealing from him the entire time. Brianna was sobbing on the floor, her silk dress stained with cheap wine. Trent's parents were cowering in the dining room, their fake wealth completely exposed. The police cruisers were flashing their lights through the windows, bathing the entire house in the harsh, undeniable reality of the truth. The lead detective stepped away from the front door and turned his full attention to my father. Warren was still pinned against the hallway wall, clutching his chest as if his heart was about to give out. Two officers were already making their way upstairs with evidence bags, searching for the laptop used to file the fraudulent loan. I stood quietly in the foyer, watching the man who had terrified me for 3 decades shrink under the bright lights of the police flashlights. "Mr. Warren," the detective said, his voice dropping to a low interrogative register. "We have digital forensics linking the IP address of this exact house to an attempted felony identity theft that occurred less than 2 hours ago. We also have a legally binding confession of debt proving that your son-in-law embezzled a massive amount of money from your accounts. Do you want to explain your involvement before I have my officers place you in handcuffs right next to him?" Warren looked at the handcuffs glinting under the porch light. He looked at the officers marching through his pristine house. Then he looked at Trent, who was still struggling against the police on the front steps. The illusion of family loyalty that my father had preached to me my entire life evaporated in less than 3 seconds. When faced with the reality of a prison sentence, Warren did exactly what a coward always does. He pointed the finger. "It was him," Warren screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. He thrust his shaking hand toward Trent. "I did not do it. I did not steal anything. It was all Trent's idea." Trent stopped struggling against the officers. He turned his head, staring at my father with a look of absolute venomous shock. "He is a liar." Warren continued, his words spilling out in a frantic, breathless rush. "He told me he needed a bridge loan. He told me to pull up Camille's old tax documents from the safe. He is the one who typed the application. He is the one who routed the money to his own shell account. I was just trying to help him. He manipulated me. You have to believe me, officer. I am a respected man in this community. I would never commit a crime." The silence that followed his confession was heavy and suffocating. My father had just openly admitted to providing my secure social security number to a criminal. He had handed over the weapon, and now he was begging for mercy because he did not pull the trigger. On the front porch, Trent let out a dark, twisted laugh. It started low, rumbling in his chest before erupting into a manic, hysterical sound that echoed down the quiet suburban street. The refined, polite finance bro was completely gone. His face contorted into an ugly sneer, completely dropping the carefully constructed facade he had worn for the past 3 years. "You pathetic, desperate old fool," Trent spat, straining against the officer's grip to lean toward the open doorway. "You were trying to help me. You were trying to save your own pathetic image. You knew exactly what we were doing, Warren. You handed me her social security card because you were absolutely terrified of losing your precious country club status." Brianna dragged herself up from the floor, her tear-streaked face pale with disbelief. "Trent, what are you saying?" she whimpered, reaching a trembling hand toward the door. "Tell them my father is lying. Tell them you did not steal from us." Trent sneered at her, his eyes filled with absolute disgust. "Oh, shut up, Brianna. I am so sick of listening to your whiny, entitled voice. You are just as fake as this entire family." Brianna gasped, taking a step back as if he had physically struck her. "You thought I was your golden ticket, did you not?" Trent continued, his voice dripping with pure venom. "You all thought you were marrying into old money. You thought my family was elite. Well, guess what? We are drowning in debt. We have been broke for years. I only married you because your father paraded around like he was some loaded real estate mogul." I looked at Warren and saw an insecure, desperate Mark who would do absolutely anything for a little bit of white country club validation. My father let out a choked sob, his knees buckling slightly as the brutal truth hit him. The man he had worshipped, the son-in-law he had sacrificed my future for, had literally targeted him because he was an easy, pathetic victim. "You are a complete joke, Warren!" Trent screamed, his face turning purple with rage. "I drained your retirement accounts. I took the equity out of your house. I funded my entire life with your money, and you just smiled and handed it over because I let you play golf with my father. You literally handed me your other daughter's identity tonight just to keep the lie going. You are not a victim. You are a willing accomplice." Trent turned his furious gaze toward me. He looked at my tailored suit, my calm expression, and the corporate lawyer standing silently by my side. "And you," he snarled. "You are the only one in this miserable family who actually has any real power, and they treated you like garbage. If I had known you were the one holding the actual wealth, I would have targeted you instead." I stepped forward, looking down at him from the threshold of the door. "But you did not, Trent. You targeted the weak ones, and now you are going to federal prison. Take him to the precinct," the lead detective ordered, clearly disgusted by the entire display. The officers shoved Trent forward, marching him down the driveway toward the flashing lights of the cruiser. Richard and Helen ran out of the dining room, chasing after the officers. "Trent," Helen wailed, her hands flying to her face. "Richard, call someone. Call the mayor. We cannot let them take our son." Richard stopped at the edge of the porch, looking defeated and entirely broken. "We do not know the mayor, Helen," he said, his voice completely hollow. "We do not know anyone. We do not have the money for a lawyer." Helen collapsed against one of the porch pillars, sobbing hysterically as the officers pushed her son into the back of the police car and slammed the door shut. Inside the foyer, the rat race was officially over. The alliance built on lies, arrogance, and mutual exploitation had completely cannibalized itself. Brianna was sitting on the bottom step of the staircase, rocking back and forth, repeating that her life was ruined. The perfect marriage she had thrown in my face for years was nothing but a calculated financial scam. She had no husband, no money, and no social standing left to protect. My father was still leaning against the wall, staring blankly at the open front door. His breathing was shallow and ragged. He had sacrificed his own flesh and blood to buy the respect of a man who secretly despised him. He had lost his retirement. He had lost his reputation. And now he had just confessed to his part in a federal crime in front of a dozen police officers. The lead detective pulled out a small notepad and walked over to Warren. "Mr. Warren, based on your own admission of providing the stolen documents, I am going to need you to come down to the station for a formal recorded statement. You are officially a person of interest in a felony conspiracy." Warren did not argue. He did not puff out his chest or try to use his booming voice. He just nodded slowly, looking like a hollow shell of the tyrant he used to be. I watched the officers guide him out the door. He walked past me without making eye contact. He had nothing left to say. The house of cards had not just collapsed. It had completely disintegrated, leaving nothing but the pathetic truth laid bare for everyone to see. I turned to David, signaling that we were finally done here. It was time to let the dust settle and prepare for the final chapter. The heavy oak door remained wide open, letting the cold night air sweep through the grand foyer of my childhood home. The red and blue lights from the police cruisers continued to flash violently against the walls, casting long, erratic shadows across the imported hardwood floors. My father was gone, driven away to the precinct to formally confess his part in a federal crime. Trent was locked in the back of a separate cruiser, his arrogant threats completely muffled behind the thick bulletproof glass. I stood in the center of the foyer, feeling an overwhelming sense of calm. The frantic, desperate energy that had fueled this family for decades had finally burned itself out. Footsteps echoed heavily at the top of the grand staircase. I looked up to see my mother, Yvonne, slowly descending the steps. She was clutching her silk bathrobe tightly around her waist, her face pale and drawn. She had clearly hidden upstairs when the police arrived, entirely incapable of facing the reality of the situation. She looked at the shattered wine decanter on the floor, at Brianna sobbing hysterically on the bottom step, and finally at me, Camille. Yvonne whispered, her voice trembling violently. "Where is your father? What happened to Trent?" "They are exactly where they belong, Mom," I said, my voice perfectly level. "They are on their way to a federal holding cell." Yvonne let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. She rushed down the remaining stairs and dropped to her knees next to Brianna, wrapping her arms around her golden child. "This cannot be happening," Yvonne cried out, rocking Brianna back and forth. "We have to call a lawyer. We have to fix this. We still have the house. We can take out another line of credit to pay for their bail. We will be fine. We just have to stick together." I looked at my mother, completely astounded by her unwavering commitment to a delusion that had already been destroyed. She was still trying to play the role of the resilient matriarch, clinging to the bricks and mortar of a house she had willingly gambled away. I turned slightly and nodded to my corporate attorney, David. He stepped forward into the light of the foyer, opening his sleek leather briefcase with a sharp, professional click. He pulled out a stack of thick manila folders. "There will be no bail, and there is no more credit," I said, clearly taking the folders from David. I walked over to the staircase and dropped one folder onto my mother's lap. I walked into the dining room where Trent's parents, Richard and Helen, were still huddled in the corner, and tossed a second folder onto the expensive mahogany table right in front of them. "Read it," I commanded. Richard reached out with trembling hands and opened the folder. Yvonne did the same, her eyes scanning the top document. It was the liability waiver Trent had signed in my office just that morning. "What is this?" Richard asked, his voice hollow and confused. "This looks like a commercial release form." "Look closer at the second paragraph," David instructed, his tone carrying the cold, undeniable weight of the law. "Your son did not just sign a venue release form. He signed a legally binding confession of debt. He formally acknowledged that he embezzled over $200,000 from Warren's retirement accounts, and he transferred absolute personal liability for that stolen money to Lumina Hospitality." Helen let out a whimpering sound, clutching her husband's arm. "I do not understand," she cried. "Even if he signed that Trent has his own business, he has investment accounts. We will just use his corporate reserve funds to hire a top-tier defense team and fight this in court." David adjusted his glasses, looking at Helen with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. "Ma'am, there are no reserve funds. The moment your son signed that document, my legal team filed an emergency commercial injunction. Every single bank account tied to Trent, his shell company, and your immediate family has been completely frozen by a federal judge. He has absolutely zero liquid assets. He cannot afford a lawyer, and he certainly cannot afford bail." Richard collapsed into one of the dining room chairs, putting his head in his hands. He was a broke man pretending to be a millionaire, and now he was going to have to watch his son go to federal prison without a single dollar to his name. In the foyer, Brianna snatched the folder from my mother's hands. She stared at the signature at the bottom of the page, the undeniable proof that her perfect husband was nothing but a criminal who had stolen her parents' entire future. He lied to me, Brianna whispered, her voice cracking, as the absolute reality of her situation finally shattered her fragile ego. He told me he was closing a $1 million real estate deal. He told me we were buying a summer home. He was using your father as a personal ATM, Brianna, I said softly. And your parents let him do it because they wanted to buy their way into his fake high society world. They sacrificed everything to keep you draped in designer clothes and comfortable in your ignorance. Yvonne stood up abruptly, her face flushing with a sudden desperate anger. She pointed a shaking finger at me. You are a monster, Camille. You planned all of this just to destroy us. You set us up because you have always been jealous of your sister. But it does not matter. You hear me. It does not matter what Trent did. Your father and I still own this property. We will sell the estate. We will downsize. We will use the equity from this house to rebuild our lives, and you will never be welcome here again. I stared at the woman who had birthed me, a woman who was still trying to use this sprawling brick colonial as a weapon against me. I reached into the final manila folder I was holding. I pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. They were stamped with the official seal of the State Superior Court. I stepped closer to my mother and held the documents right in front of her face. You do not own this property, Mom, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper. Yvonne blinked, her angry expression faltering. What are you talking about? Of course we do. David stepped up right beside me, his voice echoing clearly through the grand space. 3 months ago, the bank that held the second mortgage on this estate packaged the debt and sold it to a private commercial holding company. Your husband defaulted on the monthly payments because he had drained his accounts to fund Trent's shell corporation. I kept my eyes locked on my mother. The holding company that bought your debt is a subsidiary of Lumina Hospitality. I explained slowly, making sure she absorbed every single syllable. I own the debt. I hold the deed. And because you and Dad defaulted on the terms of the loan, I instructed my legal team to initiate the foreclosure process. Yvonne's face went completely slack. She stumbled backward, hitting the bottom railing of the staircase. The judge signed the emergency transfer of assets this afternoon. David concluded, handing a copy of the court order to Yvonne. Ms. Camille is now the sole legal owner of this entire estate. You are currently trespassing on her private property. The silence that followed was absolute and profound. It was the sound of a dynasty completely collapsing into dust. Brianna let out a gut-wrenching sob and threw herself face down onto the hardwood floor. Her perfect marriage was a scam. Her wealth was an illusion. The luxury lifestyle she had rubbed in my face for my entire adult life had been funded by stolen money, and now she was entirely destitute. She had no education she could actually use, no work ethic, and absolutely nowhere to go. Richard and Helen slowly walked out of the dining room looking like ghosts. They did not say a word to me. They did not try to argue or threaten me with their imaginary connections. They just walked out the front door and into the cold night, facing a reality where their son was going to prison and they had no way to save him. My mother slid down the banister, landing on the stairs next to her sobbing golden child. She looked around the grand foyer at the crystal chandeliers, the sweeping staircase, the expensive artwork on the walls. This house was her entire identity. It was the fortress she had used to protect herself from the real world, the ultimate symbol of her compliance to my father's tyranny. And now the daughter she had thrown away owned every single brick of it. Camille, Yvonne whispered, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and running down her cheeks. Please, where are we supposed to go? I looked down at them. For the first time in 35 years, I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel the desperate urge to rescue them or sacrifice my own peace to make them comfortable. They were finally experiencing the exact same cold, unforgiving reality they had forced me to live in for my entire life. You can go wherever you want, I said, turning my back on them and walking toward the open front door. But you have 30 days to get your things out of my house. I walked out of the grand foyer and stepped onto the front porch, the cool night air greeting me like an old friend. David followed quietly behind me, pulling the heavy oak door shut with a loud final click that echoed across the lawn. The police cruisers were already gone. The street was quiet again. I walked down the driveway to my luxury SUV, unlocked the doors, and got behind the wheel. As I drove away from the neighborhood, leaving the ruins of my toxic family behind me in the dark, I looked forward to the bright, undeniable future I had built entirely with my own two hands. The morning after the arrests, the sun rose over the city as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. I sat in my downtown office sipping my coffee and reviewed the final eviction paperwork David had prepared. At 10 o'clock sharp, I drove back to the suburban estate. I did not go alone. I brought a licensed process server and 2 private security guards. When we pulled up to the house, the front door was slightly ajar. Warren had been released on his own recognizance pending his federal arraignment, but he looked like a man who had aged 20 years overnight. He answered the door wearing wrinkled sweatpants, his eyes bloodshot and sunken. Brianna was standing right behind him, clutching a half-empty coffee mug, looking completely hollowed out. The process server stepped forward and handed them the thick legal envelopes. Warren looked down at the documents, his hands shaking as he read the bold print. 30-day notice to vacate. Warren looked up at me. The arrogant tyrant from the diner was completely gone. In his place was a desperate, calculating man who suddenly realized he was standing in the presence of a multimillionaire. He tried to straighten his posture, attempting to summon the ghosts of his former authority. "Camille, please." Warren started, his voice adopting a sickeningly smooth, pleading tone. "We need to talk about this. You are upset, and you have every right to be. I made some terrible financial miscalculations, but you cannot throw your own family out onto the street. Think about how this looks. Think about our community. African American families are supposed to stick together through hardship. We lift each other up. You cannot let the church and the neighbors see you evict your own father. It goes against everything we stand for." I stared at him, absolutely repulsed by his blatant manipulation. He had never cared about community or uplifting our people when he was busy kissing up to Trent's racist, arrogant white family. He had happily thrown his black daughter under the bus for a chance to rub elbows with the country club elite. And now that his white knight was sitting in a federal holding cell, he suddenly wanted to invoke the sacred bond of black family loyalty. "Do not you dare weaponize our culture to save your own skin," I said, my voice echoing off the brick porch. "You did not care about family loyalty when you took out a second mortgage to fund a fraud. You did not care about uplifting your blood when you tried to steal my identity and ruin my credit. The only community you ever cared about was the one you could not afford to be in." Brianna stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Camille, I have nothing. Trent's accounts are frozen. His parents will not even answer my calls. I do not have a job. Where am I supposed to go?" "You have an Ivy League degree, Brianna," I replied coldly. "I suggest you update your resume and start looking for entry-level work, just like you mocked me for doing 10 years ago." Warren reached out, trying to grab my arm, but my security guard immediately stepped between us. Warren threw his hands up in surrender, his eyes wide with frantic desperation. "You have to help us, Camille," he begged, his voice cracking. "You own a massive real estate empire. You have millions of dollars. You can fix this entire mess with a stroke of a pen. I am your father. I gave you your life." I looked him dead in the eye, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound sense of closure. "I am just a loser, remember," I said, throwing the exact words he had used against me in the grand foyer right back into his face. "You said my presence was an embarrassment. You told me to get out of your sight. You chose the illusion of money and the approval of an arrogant fraud over your own daughter. You made your choice, Dad. Now you have neither." I turned around and walked back to my car, leaving them standing on the porch with their eviction notices clutched in their hands. 4 days passed. The news of Trent's federal indictment and my father's involvement hit the local papers, completely destroying whatever fragile social standing my family had left. I spent those days focusing on Lumina hospitality, completely blocking out the noise of their ruined lives. Then, on a rainy Thursday evening, the intercom in my luxury penthouse buzzed. It was my lobby concierge. "Ms. Camille," the concierge said politely, I am so sorry to disturb you, but your mother is down here. She is extremely distressed and asking to see you. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights blur through the rain. A part of me wanted to tell security to send her away, but I knew this confrontation was inevitable. Send her up, I replied. A few minutes later, the private elevator doors opened directly into my foyer. Yvonne stepped out, and the sight of her actually made my breath catch in my throat. She was completely stripped of her suburban armor. There were no pearls. There was no perfectly styled hair or expensive cashmere sweater. She was wearing a plain raincoat. Her shoulders slumped, her face deeply lined with exhaustion and grief. She looked like a broken, terrified 60-year-old woman who had finally woken up from a 35-year nightmare. She stood in the entryway of my beautiful penthouse, looking around at the modern art and the expansive view, completely overwhelmed by the reality of the life I had built without her. Camille Yvonne whispered, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the rain against the glass. I did not offer her a drink. I did not invite her to sit on the plush velvet sofa. I just stood in the center of the living room waiting. I am so sorry, she choked out, the tears immediately spilling over her cheeks. I am so incredibly sorry. For everything. I was so blind. I let him control me. I let him convince me that Trent was our salvation, and I let him treat you like you were nothing. I watched him hurt you, and I did nothing to stop it because I was too much of a coward to rock the boat. She took a hesitant step forward, clasping her hands together. Brianna is moving into a cheap motel. She sold her wedding ring to pay for the first week. Warren is facing years in prison, and the legal fees are non-existent. The bank accounts are entirely empty. I have absolutely nowhere to go, Camille. Please, I am your mother. I am begging you for a place to stay. Just until I can figure things out. I looked at the woman who had birthed me. The anger had burned out days ago, leaving only a clinical protective clarity. I knew that if I let her move into my penthouse, she would bring the toxic residue of my father right through the front door. She would start making excuses for Brianna. She would slip back into her old habits of enabling the people who used her. I had fought too hard for my peace to let it be compromised now. I will not let you live here, Mom, I said firmly. Yvonne's face crumbled. She let out a soft sob and nodded, turning to walk back toward the elevator. But I am not going to let you live on the street either, I added. She stopped, turning back to look at me with a glimmer of desperate hope. I walked over to my kitchen island and picked up a folder I had prepared 2 days ago, anticipating this exact moment. I walked back and handed it to her. I own a modest apartment building on the east side of the city, I explained. There is a 1-bedroom unit available on the 2nd floor. I will cover the rent, the utilities, and provide a basic grocery stipend for the next 12 months. Yvonne grabbed the folder, weeping openly now. Thank you, she cried. Thank you, Camille. You have no idea what this means to me. I promise I will not be a burden. I held up my hand, stopping her gratitude dead in its tracks. There are conditions, I said, my voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. This is not a blank check, and this is not a return to the way things were. If you accept this apartment, you must legally separate from Warren immediately. You will not give him a key. You will not give Brianna a single dollar of the grocery stipend. And most importantly, you will attend intensive weekly therapy with a professional I have already selected and paid for. Yvonne stared at me, her eyes wide. Separate from Warren, she repeated the concept clearly, terrifying to a woman who had spent her entire adult life in his shadow. You have enabled his abuse and his financial ruin for 35 years, I said, looking her directly in the eye. I am offering you a chance to finally figure out who you are without him. I am offering you a safe place to heal. But if you try to bring his toxicity into the space I am paying for, or if you miss a single therapy session, I will terminate the lease immediately and you will be entirely on your own. No more enabling, no more covering up the truth. You either choose your own healing or you walk back out that door and go down with his sinking ship. The silence in the penthouse was heavy, broken only by the steady drum of the rain. Yvonne looked down at the folder in her hands, then back up at me. She saw the ironclad boundary in my eyes. She knew I was completely serious. For the first time in my life, my mother did not defer to my father. She did not make an excuse for Brianna. She took a deep breath, clutching the folder tightly against her chest, and nodded. "I will do it," she whispered. "I will do whatever it takes." I stepped back, feeling a profound sense of resolution wash over me. I had not saved my family. Some families cannot be saved. But I had saved myself, and I had finally given my mother the tools to save herself if she was brave enough to use them. Exactly 1 month passed since the night the police cruisers dismantled my family's suburban fortress. The calendar finally landed on the exact date that was supposed to host the extravagant 60th birthday gala. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the private rooftop dining room at the Vanguard estate, looking out over the glittering city skyline. The room was softly lit by crystal wall sconces and the warm glow of a dozen pillar candles arranged on the center table. It was the same building my father had tried to ban me from, but the energy in the room could not have been more different. There were no hundreds of fake friends. There were no racist white in-laws to impress. There was no anxiety hanging in the air. The heavy oak doors opened quietly behind me. I turned around to see my mother Yvonne stepping into the room. The transformation she had undergone in just 30 days was nothing short of remarkable. She was not wearing the stiff, uncomfortable designer gowns my father always forced her into. She was wearing a simple, elegant navy blue dress. The heavy pearl necklaces and diamond tennis bracelets were gone. Her face was entirely free of the tight, anxious lines that used to frame her mouth. She looked softer, lighter, and for the first time in my entire life, she looked genuinely happy. She walked over to the windows and stood beside me, looking out at the sprawling city lights. "It is beautiful up here, Camille," she said softly. We sat down at the intimate table set for two. My executive chef had prepared a customized 5-course tasting menu featuring all of my mother's actual favorite dishes, the Southern comfort foods my father had always banned from their diet because he thought they were not sophisticated enough for his high society image. We ate perfectly seared scallops, blackened catfish, and slow-braised short ribs. We actually talked. We did not discuss country club gossip or the stock market. We did not pretend our lives were perfect. Yvonne told me about her therapy sessions. She had not missed a single one. She told me how agonizing it was to sit in a room with a professional and unpack 35 years of enabling and self-betrayal. She admitted that leaving my father was the most terrifying thing she had ever done, but waking up in her own quiet apartment every morning without someone criticizing how she made the coffee was the greatest luxury she had ever experienced. "I wrote Warren a letter this week," Yvonne said, setting her wine glass down on the crisp white tablecloth. "I did not give it to him. My therapist told me to just write it for myself. I wrote down every single time I let him silence me. And then I wrote down every single time I chose his comfort over your safety." She looked across the table at me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I am so deeply sorry that it took losing everything for me to finally see you, Camille. You built this beautiful life completely on your own, and I missed all of it. I want to spend whatever time I have left getting to know the incredible woman my daughter became." I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. The deep, aching wound in my chest that had defined my entire childhood finally began to close. We did not need to force a perfect relationship overnight. We just needed the truth. And sitting in that quiet, beautiful room, sharing a meal without the suffocating weight of my father's ego, I knew we were finally on solid ground. While my mother and I were peacefully looking out over the city, the reality of my father's choices was crashing down on him with brutal, unrelenting force. The legal system did not care about his polo shirts or his country club memberships. Warren was officially indicted on multiple federal charges of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit identity theft. His passport was seized, his bank accounts were drained by exorbitant legal defense fees. The high society friends he had sacrificed his own flesh and blood to impress completely abandoned him. When his name hit the local papers attached to a federal embezzlement scandal, the country club immediately revoked his membership. The men he used to play golf with stopped returning his calls. Without my mother there to absorb his anger, and without the stolen money to fund his delusions, he was reduced to living in a cramped, dark studio apartment on the industrial side of town. My legal team had successfully foreclosed on the suburban estate, and Lumina Hospitality sold the property to a lovely young couple the very next week. Warren lost his kingdom, his reputation, and his freedom was currently hanging in the balance of a federal judge. Trent was entirely denied bail. He was sitting in a maximum security holding facility awaiting trial for stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars. His wealthy facade was permanently erased, leaving him exposed as nothing more than a common thief. And then there was Brianna. The golden child who had spent her entire life mocking my work ethic was finally forced to enter the real world without a single safety net. Because Trent's assets were seized and my parents were completely bankrupt, Brianna had no choice but to find a way to survive on her own. She tried to apply for corporate jobs using her Ivy League degree, but a quick background check linking her to a massive federal fraud case made her entirely unemployable in the financial sector. She was eventually forced to take a minimum-wage retail job at a mid-tier department store in the local mall. The sister who used to flaunt designer bags and mock my budget boutique outfits was now required to wear a stiff polyester uniform. She spent 8 hours a day on her feet, organizing clearance racks, dealing with screaming customers, and taking orders from a manager who was 10 years younger than her. A portion of her meager paychecks was automatically garnished every month by my legal team to slowly pay back the debts her husband had incurred. She was exhausted, humbled, and completely trapped in the reality she used to mock me for fighting my way out of. I did not take joy in their suffering. I simply did not think about them at all. I was entirely focused on the future. Lumina Hospitality continued to expand, acquiring 2 more luxury properties by the end of the year. I was thriving, surrounded by a chosen family of brilliant colleagues, loyal friends, and a mother who was finally learning how to love me properly. Looking back on the decades of rejection and emotional abuse, I realized that my family thought they were breaking me down. They thought their constant criticism and financial sabotage would keep me small and compliant. They threw heavy, jagged bricks at me every single day of my life. But they vastly underestimated my strength. I did not let those bricks crush me. I picked up every single one of them, and I used them to build an absolute empire. I walked away from the people who shared my blood to protect my spirit. Sometimes the greatest wealth you can build is your own peace of mind. Have you ever had to evict toxic family members from your life? How did you handle the guilt? Share your story in the comments below. And if this resonated with you, hit subscribe. Your story is still being written. The greatest lesson I learned from this ordeal is that blood does not automatically equal loyalty, and you cannot heal in the same environment that actively breaks you. For decades, I desperately chased the conditional approval of people who were committed to misunderstanding my worth. But true empowerment comes the moment you stop waiting for a seat at a toxic table and start building your own empire instead. Setting ironclad boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. Your value is never defined by the limitations of those who refuse to see it. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your peace, hit subscribe and share your story of resilience in the comments below.